Richard Hernandez wasn't supposed to be anyone's hero. The 38-year-old single father spent his nights mopping the marble floors of Pinnacle Industries corporate headquarters in downtown Meridian Falls, invisible to the executives who rushed past him during their late meetings. What he didn't know was that Cheska Mendez, daughter of the company's CEO, had been watching him for months, and what she would do to defend him at the next board meeting would not only shock the entire corporate world but transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us in the comments what moment changed your perspective about someone you'd overlooked, and make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story will absolutely leave you speechless. The grandfather clock in the lobby of Pinnacle Industries chimed 9:30 p.m. as Richard Hernandez wheeled his cleaning cart past the towering glass windows that overlooked the bustling city of Meridian Falls. The building's 43 floors housed one of the nation's most successful technology conglomerates, but to Richard, it was simply where he worked the night shift to keep his 8-year-old daughter, Elena, fed, clothed, and in school. Richard had been cleaning these same hallways for 3 years now, ever since the construction accident that had shattered his left leg and ended his career as a foreman. The settlement money had barely covered Elena's medical bills when she was born prematurely, and the disability payments weren't enough to support them both. Night janitor work was all he could find that accommodated his limp and allowed him to be home when Elena got ready for school each morning. Most nights, the 38th floor was empty by the time Richard reached it. The executive suites belonged to people who lived in a different world, one where problems were solved with phone calls and money, not with mops and determination. But tonight, as Richard approached the corner office that housed the CEO's daughter's workspace, he noticed the lights were still on. Cheska Mendez sat hunched over her laptop, designer heels kicked off under her desk, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun. At 26, she was the youngest vice president in Pinnacle Industries history, though most people assumed her position was handed to her because her father, Victor Mendez, owned the company. They didn't know about the MBA she'd earned summa cum laude from Stanford, or the late nights she spent analyzing market trends and developing strategies that had increased company profits by 23% in just 2 years. Richard hesitated at her doorway. He'd seen her here late many times before, always working, always focused. Unlike the other executives who barely acknowledged his existence, Cheska had a habit of looking up when he passed, offering a tired smile and sometimes even a quiet thank you for his work. Tonight, however, she looked different, stressed, maybe even upset. "Excuse me, Miss Mendez," Richard said softly, not wanting to startle her. "I can come back later if you need more time." Cheska looked up, her green eyes slightly red-rimmed. She'd been staring at the same financial report for the past hour, but her mind kept wandering to the conversation she'd overheard in the conference room earlier that day, board members discussing cost-cutting measures and unnecessary personnel expenses with the cold detachment of people who had never worried about making rent. "Oh, Richard, you don't have to wait," she said, closing her laptop and rubbing her eyes. "I was just finishing up anyway." Richard had always been impressed by the fact that she knew his name. In 3 years of cleaning this building, she was one of only 5 people who had ever bothered to learn it. He began emptying her wastebasket, moving with the efficient, quiet motions he'd perfected over countless nights. "Long day?" he asked, immediately regretting the question. What did he know about the pressures of corporate leadership? But Cheska surprised him by actually answering. "The longest," she sighed, gathering her papers. "Sometimes I think the hardest part of this job isn't the work itself. It's watching people make decisions about other people's lives like they're just numbers on a spreadsheet." Richard paused in his cleaning, struck by the genuine frustration in her voice. In his world, people's lives were always treated like numbers: hours worked, wages earned, benefits calculated. But he'd never heard anyone from the executive floor express anything resembling empathy for the people who kept the building running. "I imagine it must be difficult," he said carefully, "having to balance business needs with, well, people." Cheska studied his face, noting the thoughtful way he'd chosen his words. Most people either kiss up to her because of who her father was or dismiss her entirely. Richard's response was neither. It was genuine, thoughtful, and somehow wise. "You know, Richard," she said, slipping her feet back into her heels, I've been working in this building for 2 years, and you're one of the hardest working people I've ever seen here. You're always professional, always thorough, and you somehow manage to clean around our messes without ever making us feel like we're in your way." Richard felt his cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "Just doing my job, ma'am." "No," Cheska said firmly, standing and gathering her briefcase. "You're doing much more than that. You're taking care of people even when they don't notice or appreciate it." She paused at the doorway, seeming to wrestle with something. "Richard, can I ask you something personal?" He nodded, curious despite himself. "Do you have family, people depending on you?" "My daughter, Elena," Richard said, his voice automatically softening the way it always did when he talked about her. "She's 8, smart as a whip and twice as stubborn as her old man." Cheska smiled for the first time that evening. "She sounds wonderful. It must be hard, balancing work and raising her alone." "We make it work," Richard said simply. "She's worth every sacrifice." As Cheska walked toward the elevator, she turned back one more time. "Richard, thank you. Not just for cleaning my office, but for reminding me that the most important work happening in this building might not be happening in the boardroom." After she left, Richard stood alone in the pristine office, her words echoing in his mind. He'd never thought of his work as important, necessary, maybe, but not important. To most people walking these halls, he was invisible, just part of the building's infrastructure, like the heating system or the security cameras. What Richard didn't know was that Cheska had been fighting a battle on behalf of people like him for months. What he couldn't have imagined was that their brief conversation had just strengthened her resolve to take a stand that would put everything on the line. And what neither of them suspected was that in 3 days, when the board convened for their quarterly meeting, Cheska would do something that would change not only Richard's life, but the entire culture of Pinnacle Industries. As Richard finished cleaning the executive floor and headed toward the elevator, Elena's drawing from that morning crinkled in his shirt pocket. A stick-figure man with a mop standing next to a small girl, both of them smiling under a rainbow. At the bottom, in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "My dad is a hero." Sometimes, Richard thought as the elevator descended toward the lobby, children see things more clearly than adults do. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The emergency call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, piercing through Richard's deep sleep like a knife. Elena's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was on the line from Meridian Falls General Hospital, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Mr. Hernandez, there's been an incident at the school. Elena collapsed during the overnight field trip. She's stable, but the doctors need you here immediately." Richard's hands shook as he threw on clothes, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Elena had been so excited about the astronomy club's overnight camping trip at Riverside Elementary. She'd packed her small backpack with meticulous care, including the telescope he'd bought her for her birthday. Second-hand, but she'd treated it like treasure. The 40-minute drive to the hospital felt like hours. When Richard finally burst through the emergency room doors, still wearing his Pinnacle Industries uniform from the shift he'd abandoned, Mrs. Patterson met him with red-rimmed eyes. "She's going to be okay," she said quickly, seeing the terror on his face. "But Richard, there's something you need to know. Elena has been hiding how sick she's been feeling. The doctors ran some tests." Dr. Sarah Whitefield, Elena's pediatrician, appeared at Richard's shoulder. Her expression was gentle but serious. "Mr. Hernandez, Elena has developed a severe case of juvenile arthritis. It's been progressing for months, but she never complained because she didn't want to worry you." Richard felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Arthritis? But she's only 8. "It's more common than people think," Dr. Whitefield explained, leading him toward Elena's room. "The good news is that with proper treatment, children with this condition can live completely normal lives. The challenging news is that the treatment is expensive and ongoing." Through the small window in Elena's door, Richard could see his daughter sleeping peacefully, her small hand connected to an IV drip. Even unconscious, she looked so much like her mother, the same dark curls, the same determined set to her jaw. Maria would have known what to do, would have noticed the signs Richard had missed while working double shifts to keep them afloat. "How expensive?" Richard asked quietly. Dr. Whitefield consulted her tablet. The initial treatment plan, including specialized medications and physical therapy, would run approximately $3,200 per month. Your current insurance through Pinnacle Industries covers about 40% of that cost. Richard did the math in his head. $1,920 per month that he didn't have. His entire monthly salary as a night janitor was barely $2,400. Even with his small disability check, there was no way to cover Elena's treatment and still pay for food, rent, and her other needs. "Doctor," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what happens if we can't afford the treatment?" The silence that followed told him everything. Meanwhile, 3 floors above in the hospital's administrative wing, Cheska Mendez was having her own crisis. She'd been visiting her grandmother, who was recovering from hip surgery, when she spotted a familiar figure in scrubs hurrying past the elevator, Mrs. Patterson, whom she recognized from the various school board meetings her father had forced her to attend as part of her community engagement responsibilities. Curious, Cheska had followed at a distance and overheard enough of the conversation to understand that Richard's daughter was seriously ill. Now she sat in the hospital chapel, staring at the stained glass and thinking about the conversation she'd had with Richard just days earlier. "Taking care of people, even when they don't notice or appreciate it," she'd told him. But who was taking care of Richard? Cheska pulled out her phone and began making calls. First to Dr. Whitefield, using her family's considerable influence to get information that would normally be confidential. Then to her assistant, demanding a complete breakdown of Pinnacle Industries' employee benefits package. Finally, to her father's private accountant, asking questions about charitable deductions and corporate social responsibility initiatives. What she discovered made her stomach churn. Pinnacle Industries' health insurance plan was deliberately designed to provide minimal coverage for serious conditions. The company saved millions annually by forcing employees to bear the bulk of their medical costs. Meanwhile, the executive health plan, the one that covered Cheska and her family, paid 95% of all medical expenses with no caps or limitations. But it was the final piece of information that ignited something fierce and protective in Cheska's chest. Richard Hernandez wasn't just any night janitor. His employee file revealed that he was a decorated Army veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before his construction career. His injury wasn't just a random accident, it was the result of a workplace incident involving a Pinnacle Industries construction project where he'd been injured while trying to save a coworker's life. The settlement he'd received had been deliberately minimized by Pinnacle's legal team, who had argued that his military injury history made him a pre-existing liability. Richard had been forced to accept $50,000 instead of the $200,000 he should have received, and had been grateful just to get the night janitor job that barely kept him and Elena afloat. As dawn broke over Meridian Falls, Cheska sat in her car in the hospital parking lot watching Richard emerge from the building carrying his sleeping daughter. His face was gray with exhaustion and worry, but his movements were infinitely gentle as he secured Elena in their aging Honda Civic. Cheska knew that in 3 days, the Pinnacle Industries board would meet for their quarterly review. On the agenda was a proposal to cut costs by reducing employee benefits even further and eliminating what the board called redundant maintenance positions, a euphemism for firing half the janitorial staff. She also knew that her father expected her to support these measures as part of her ongoing education in fiscal responsibility. But watching Richard drive away with his sick daughter, Cheska made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't just oppose the cost-cutting measures, she would expose the entire system that kept people like Richard trapped in poverty while executives like herself lived in luxury. She pulled out her laptop and began typing an email to every board member, with a copy to her father. Proposal for Emergency Board Meeting, Employee Welfare Initiative. Gentlemen, I am requesting an emergency addition to Thursday's board meeting agenda. I have uncovered serious discrepancies in our employee benefit structure that require immediate attention and pose significant legal and ethical risks to our company. I will be presenting a comprehensive proposal for reform, including case studies that demonstrate the human cost of our current policies. I trust you will give this matter the serious consideration it deserves. Respectfully, Cheska Mendez, Vice President, Strategic Development. As she hit send, Cheska realized she was about to go to war with her own family's company. But some battles, she thought, remembering Richard's words about sacrifice, were worth fighting. What Richard didn't know as he carried Elena up to their small apartment was that his quiet dignity and devoted fatherhood had just inspired the most powerful ally he could never have imagined to take a stand that would shake Pinnacle Industries to its foundation. Richard returned to work Wednesday night with Elena's words echoing in his mind. "Daddy, please don't worry about me. I'm brave like you." She'd said it while he was tucking her into bed, her small hand squeezing his with a strength that belied her 8 years. The medication Dr. Whitfield had prescribed was already helping with the pain, but Richard knew it was only a temporary solution. Without the specialized treatment plan, Elena's condition would worsen. The Pinnacle Industries building felt different as Richard pushed his cleaning cart through the lobby. Every marble tile he mopped, every brass fixture he polished, seemed to mock him with its pristine perfection. This building represented millions of dollars in luxury and power, while his daughter suffered because he couldn't afford $1,920 a month for her medicine. As Richard rode the elevator to the 38th floor, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of starting his usual cleaning routine, he walked directly to Cheska's office. The lights were on, she was working late again, bent over what looked like financial documents and legal papers scattered across her desk. "Ms. Mendez," Richard knocked softly on the open doorframe. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to speak with you about something important." Cheska looked up, immediately noticing the change in Richard's demeanor. Gone was the quiet deference he usually showed. In its place was something raw and desperate, a father backed into a corner with nowhere left to retreat. "Richard, of course, please come in," and close the door. Richard had never sat down in an executive office before. The leather chair was more comfortable than his couch at home, and he felt awkwardly out of place in his janitor's uniform, certificates, awards, and expensive artwork. "Ms. Mendez, I don't know why I'm here," Richard began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I've never asked for help from anyone in this building, never complained, never caused problems, but my daughter—" His voice cracked, and he took a deep breath before continuing. "Elena is sick, really sick, and I can't afford to help her." Cheska set down her pen and gave Richard her complete attention. She'd been preparing for this conversation since sending her email to the board, but hearing the pain in his voice made her previous research feel coldly academic. "Tell me about Elena," she said softly. For the next 20 minutes, Richard opened up about his daughter in a way he'd never done with anyone since Maria died. He told Cheska about Elena's love of astronomy, her determination to understand how stars were born and died. He described how she'd been limping slightly for weeks, but claimed it was just from growing too fast. He explained how she'd hidden her pain because she'd overheard him on the phone with the electric company, negotiating a payment plan to keep their power on. "She's the smartest person I know," Richard said, pulling out his phone to show Cheska a photo. In it, Elena was pointing at Saturn through her second-hand telescope, her face lit up with wonder. "She wants to be an astronomer when she grows up, says she's going to discover a new planet and name it after her mom." Cheska studied the photo, seeing not just a sick child, but a brilliant young mind whose potential was being threatened by poverty and corporate greed. "Richard, what you're describing isn't just medical neglect, it's a systemic failure, and you're not the only employee facing this situation." She turned her laptop around, showing Richard a spreadsheet she'd been compiling. "I've been researching our employee health insurance claims. In the past year alone, 17 Pinnacle employees have had to choose between medical treatment and keeping their jobs. 6 have declared bankruptcy due to medical debt. 3 have quit rather than burden their families with mounting hospital bills." Richard stared at the numbers, each one representing a family like his caught in an impossible situation. "Why are you showing me this?" Cheska leaned forward, her green eyes intense with purpose. Because tomorrow afternoon, the board of directors is meeting to vote on further cuts to employee benefits. They're also planning to eliminate half the janitorial positions, claiming they're redundant overhead. Your job, Richard, is on the chopping block. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. They're going to fire me? The words hit Richard like a physical blow. They're going to fire me? Not if I can help it, Cheska said firmly. Richard, I'm going to ask you to do something that might seem impossible. I want you to come to that board meeting with me. I want you to tell Elena's story to the people who make decisions about employee benefits. I want you to help me change this system. Richard stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city. Below, the lights of Meridian Falls twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing families struggling to survive, to pay bills, to care for their children. Miss Mendez, with all due respect, these people don't care about stories. They care about profit margins. I'm just a janitor to them. That's exactly why this matters, Cheska insisted, standing and moving to join him at the window. Richard, you're not just a janitor. You're a decorated veteran who saved lives in Afghanistan. You're a construction foreman who was injured saving a coworker's life on a Pinnacle project. You're a single father raising a brilliant daughter against impossible odds. You represent everything that's right about the American work ethic, and our company has failed you at every turn. Richard turned to face her, seeing something in her expression he'd never noticed before. Cheska Mendez wasn't just the CEO's privileged daughter. She was a woman who'd found her cause worth fighting for. What exactly are you asking me to do? Cheska walked back to her desk and picked up a thick folder. I've prepared a comprehensive presentation about employee welfare reform. I have financial projections showing how improved benefits actually increase productivity and reduce turnover costs. I have legal documentation proving that our current policies violate federal workplace safety guidelines. But numbers and laws aren't enough to change minds that have been closed for decades. She handed him the folder. I need someone to put a human face on this crisis. I need someone to stand up in that boardroom and speak truth to power. I need someone who understands what it means to sacrifice everything for family. Richard opened the folder, seeing pages of research about families like his own, statistics about medical bankruptcies, and proposals for reform that seemed almost too good to be true. Comprehensive health coverage, mental health support, childcare assistance, educational scholarships for employees' children. You really think this could work? I think it's our only chance, Cheska admitted. Richard, I won't lie to you. If we do this, there will be consequences. My father owns this company, and I'm about to publicly challenge decades of corporate policy. The board members have been friends with my family for years, and I'm about to accuse them of systemic cruelty. They'll be furious. She paused, looking out at the city lights. And you'll be putting your job on the line by speaking out. If this fails, they might not just fire you. They might make it impossible for you to find work anywhere in Meridian Falls. Richard thought about Elena, sleeping peacefully at home with Mrs. Gonzalez watching over her. He thought about all the other children whose parents worked in this building, struggling with medical bills and impossible choices. He thought about Maria, who had always taught him that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do. Miss Mendez, Cheska, he corrected himself, using her first name for the first time. If I do this, if I walk into that boardroom and tell them about Elena, what happens to her treatment in the meantime? Cheska reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a business card. I've already spoken with Dr. Whitfield. A private foundation I'm connected with has agreed to cover Elena's treatment costs during the transition period, regardless of what happens with the board. Richard stared at the card, realizing that Cheska had been planning this intervention since the moment she'd seen him at the hospital. You've already committed to helping us, even if I say no to this meeting. Elena shouldn't suffer while we fight corporate battles, Cheska said simply. But Richard, this isn't just about Elena anymore. This is about every employee in this building who's been forced to choose between their health and their livelihood. This is about changing a system that treats human beings like disposable resources.
Richard looked once more at the folder in his hands, then at the determined woman who was risking everything to fight for people she barely knew. He thought about Elena's drawing in his pocket, the one that called him a hero. Maybe it was time to earn that title. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it. I'll tell them about Elena, about what it's really like to work for this company when you're not in the executive suite." Cheska smiled for the first time in days. "Richard, you have no idea how much courage this takes. You're about to walk into a room full of millionaires and tell them they're wrong. That's not just brave, it's revolutionary." As Richard prepared to leave, Cheska handed him one final document. "Take tonight to read through this. It's a summary of your rights as an employee and a whistleblower. Whatever happens tomorrow, you'll be protected." Richard tucked the papers under his arm and headed for the door. At the threshold, he turned back one more time. "Cheska, why are you doing this? Really?" She considered the question seriously. "Because 3 days ago, you reminded me that the most important work in this building might not be happening in the boardroom. Tomorrow, we're going to prove that's true."
As Richard walked home through the quiet streets of Meridian Falls, he realized he'd just committed to the most terrifying and important thing he'd ever done. In less than 18 hours, he would stand before the most powerful people in the city and demand justice, not just for Elena, but for every working family struggling to survive in the shadow of corporate indifference. The battle was about to begin. Thursday morning arrived with an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Richard was helping Elena get ready for school when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Mr. Hernandez, this is Janet Reeves from Channel 7 News. I understand you're planning to speak at the Pinnacle Industries board meeting today about employee health care issues. Would you be willing to give us an interview?" Richard nearly dropped the phone. I'm sorry, how did you know about that?" "We received an anonymous tip this morning, along with some very compelling documentation about Pinnacle's employee benefit practices. The public has a right to know how one of our city's largest employers treats its workforce." Richard looked at Elena, who was carefully packing her school bag with the slow, deliberate movements that had become necessary since her diagnosis. The last thing he wanted was to turn their private struggle into a media spectacle. "I appreciate your interest, but I don't think—" "Mr. Hernandez," Janet interrupted gently, "I've been covering corporate accountability stories for 15 years. What's happening at Pinnacle isn't unique, but it is particularly egregious. Your story could help thousands of families across the region who are facing similar situations." After hanging up, Richard immediately called Cheska. She answered on the first ring, her voice tense with anticipation. "Richard, are you ready for this afternoon?" "Cheska, there's a news reporter who wants to interview me. She knows about the board meeting, about Elena's situation. Did you contact the media?" There was a pause. "No, but I have a feeling I know who did." "Richard, stay where you are. I'm coming over. We need to talk before this gets any bigger." 30 minutes later, Cheska arrived at Richard's modest apartment in the Riverside district, a neighborhood she'd never visited despite living in Meridian Falls her entire life. The contrast between her designer suit and the worn furniture was stark, but Elena greeted her with the unself-conscious warmth of childhood. "Are you Daddy's friend from work?" Elena asked, looking up from her telescope, which she'd set up by the living room window despite the daylight. "I hope so," Cheska said, kneeling down to Elena's level. "What are you looking at?" "Venus," Elena explained seriously. "You can see it during the day if you know where to look. Most people don't know that." She adjusted the telescope carefully. "Daddy says I'm good at seeing things other people miss." Cheska met Richard's eyes over Elena's head, understanding immediately why he was so protective of this remarkable child. "She's incredible, Richard. She's everything," he said. While Elena showed Cheska how to use the telescope, Richard's phone rang again. This time, it was Dr. Whitfield. "Mr. Hernandez, I've had 3 reporters contact the hospital this morning asking about Elena's case. I want you to know that we haven't released any information, but somehow details about her diagnosis and treatment costs have become public." Richard felt a chill of fear. "What kind of details?" "Specific information about juvenile arthritis treatment costs, insurance coverage gaps, and—" Dr. Whitfield paused uncomfortably.
Details about your financial situation that could only have come from someone with access to hospital billing records. After ending the call, Richard turned to Cheska with growing alarm. Someone leaked Elena's medical information to the press. This isn't just about the board meeting anymore. Someone's made our family a public spectacle. Cheska's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it and her face went pale. Richard, we have a problem. That message is from my father. He's moved the board meeting up to 11 a.m. instead of 3 p.m. He's trying to avoid the media attention. But that's in 2 hours, Richard protested. I haven't even called into work yet. I need to arrange for someone to watch Elena. I'll stay with Elena, came a voice from the kitchen. Mrs. Gonzalez, the elderly neighbor who often watched Elena when Richard worked late, had let herself in with the spare key. Mijo, I heard the phone ringing and thought you might need help. Mrs. Gonzalez was followed by 2 more unexpected visitors. Tommy Rodriguez, a day shift maintenance worker at Pinnacle, and Patricia Chen, a night security guard Richard recognized from the building. Richard, man, we heard what you're doing today, Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. My wife has been rationing her insulin because our insurance won't cover the new prescription. She's literally choosing between her medicine and our kids' school supplies. Patricia nodded grimly. My son needs speech therapy after his accident last year. Pinnacle's insurance approved 6 sessions. The therapist says he needs at least 30. We've been paying out of pocket and selling everything we own. Richard stared at his colleagues, realizing for the first time that his family's struggle wasn't isolated. How did you both know about today? Word spreads fast in the overnight crew, Patricia explained. We all talk during breaks, share stories about medical bills, about choosing between rent and medicine. When we heard someone was finally going to speak up, she shrugged. We wanted to make sure you knew you weren't alone. Tommy reached into his backpack and pulled out a folder thick with papers. These are medical bills from 12 other Pinnacle employees, all of us dealing with the same insurance problems, the same impossible choices. If you're willing to speak for us, we want you to have the full picture.
Cheska took the folder, quickly scanning the documents. Each page represented a family in crisis. Cancer treatments denied, emergency surgeries resulting in bankruptcy, children unable to receive necessary therapy. The scope of Pinnacle's systematic neglect was breathtaking. There's something else, Patricia said, lowering her voice. We think someone in HR has been deliberately targeting employees who file large insurance claims. Maria Santos was fired last month, officially for performance issues. Unofficially, her daughter's leukemia treatments were costing the company too much. That's illegal, Cheska said immediately. Federal law protects employees from retaliation based on medical claims. Federal law protects people who can afford lawyers, Tommy replied bitterly. Maria couldn't fight back. She needed her final paycheck more than she needed justice. Richard felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Elena anymore. It was about Maria Santos and her daughter, about Tommy's wife rationing insulin, about Patricia's son struggling to speak clearly. It was about every family trapped in a system designed to maximize profits while minimizing human dignity. His phone rang again. This time it was his supervisor, Frank Walsh. Hernandez, where the hell are you? You were supposed to be here an hour ago for overtime coverage. Frank, I need to take a personal day. There's a family emergency. Family emergency? Frank's voice dripped with skepticism. Let me guess, this has something to do with the rumors going around about you causing trouble with the board of directors. Richard felt his stomach drop. What rumors? Word is you've been meeting with Cheska Mendez, filling her head with complaints about your benefits package. Some people are saying you're trying to use your kid's illness to squeeze money out of the company. The accusation hit Richard like a physical blow. Frank, that's not what's happening. Here's what's happening, Hernandez. You show up for your shift right now, or you're fired. We've got plenty of applicants who want to work instead of playing politics. Richard looked around his living room at the people who had gathered to support him. Cheska with her legal documents and reform proposals. Tommy and Patricia with their folders of medical bills. Mrs. Gonzalez quietly organizing Elena's medication schedule, and Elena herself, adjusting her telescope to track Venus across the morning sky. "Frank," Richard said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his stomach, "I won't be coming in today. And if standing up for my daughter and my coworkers means losing my job, then I guess that's a risk I'm willing to take." He hung up the phone and looked at Cheska. "I think I just quit." "No," Cheska said firmly. "You just took a stand. There's a difference." Tommy clapped Richard on the shoulder. "Man, we've got your back. Whatever happens in that boardroom, you're not going in alone." "Actually," Patricia said, checking her watch, "we need to talk about logistics. It's 9:30 now. The meeting starts at 11. Richard, have you ever spoken in front of a board of directors before?" Richard shook his head, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was for what lay ahead. "Okay," Cheska said, taking charge. "We have 90 minutes to prepare. Patricia, can you and Tommy compile the most compelling cases from those medical bills? Focus on families with children. Board members respond better to stories about kids. Mrs. Gonzalez, would you be comfortable staying with Elena for a few hours?" "Mija, I've been taking care of children for 60 years. Elena will be fine." Elena looked up from her telescope. "Daddy, are you going to your important meeting now?" Richard knelt down beside his daughter, his heart breaking at how mature she sounded. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm going to try to help make things better for families like ours." Elena hugged him tightly. "I hope they listen to you, Daddy. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to hear important things." As Richard prepared to leave for the most important meeting of his life, he realized that Elena was right. Today's challenge wasn't just about presenting facts and figures to the board. It was about making powerful people remember how to hear the voices of those they'd learned to ignore. The battle was about to begin, and Richard finally understood he wouldn't be fighting it alone. The marble steps of Pinnacle Industries felt steeper than usual as Richard climbed them at 10:45 a.m. Wearing his only suit, a navy blue outfit he'd bought secondhand for Maria's funeral 3 years ago. The media presence outside had been overwhelming. 5 news vans, dozens of reporters shouting questions, and protesters who had somehow learned about the board meeting and arrived with signs reading, "Healthcare is a human right," and "Pinnacle profits from pain." Cheska met him at the executive elevator, her usual composure replaced by visible tension. "Richard, I need to warn you about what we're walking into. My father called an emergency session with the board members before our presentation. They've been meeting since 9 a.m. What does that mean for us?" "It means they've had time to prepare counterarguments, legal defenses, and probably a strategy to discredit everything we're about to say." Cheska pressed the button for the 42nd floor, the executive boardroom level that Richard had cleaned hundreds of times but never entered. The elevator doors opened to reveal the most luxurious space Richard had ever seen. Hand-carved mahogany panels lined the walls. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over Persian rugs worth more than Richard's annual salary. And floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Meridian Falls that made the city look like a miniature model.
"Miss Mendez," came a stern voice from behind an imposing desk. A silver-haired woman in an expensive suit approached them with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. "I'm Catherine Blackstone, Pinnacle's head of legal affairs. I need to speak with you privately before the board convenes." Cheska's jaw tightened. "Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Mr. Hernandez." "Very well." Catherine's cold eyes settled on Richard like a judge evaluating a defendant. "Mr. Hernandez, I've reviewed your employment file, your medical claims history, and your daughter's recent hospital records. I want to make something very clear before you enter that boardroom." She opened a leather briefcase and pulled out several documents. "These are signed statements from 3 of your coworkers claiming that you've been deliberately negligent in your cleaning duties for the past 6 months. There's also a formal complaint from building security about inappropriate behavior during work hours." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not true. I've never—" "Furthermore," Catherine continued, "we have documentation showing that you've been accessing executive floors without authorization, engaging in unauthorized conversations with management personnel, and using company time for personal activities." Cheska stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. "Miss Blackstone, what you're describing sounds suspiciously like retaliation against an employee who's about to expose corporate wrongdoing." Catherine smiled coldly. "What I'm describing is a pattern of poor performance that predates this situation by months. Mr. Hernandez, if you proceed with today's presentation, these performance issues will become part of your permanent employment record. Any future employer who contacts Pinnacle for a reference will learn about your reliability problems." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Richard understood immediately. Speak out today, and he'd be unemployable anywhere in Meridian Falls. Stay silent, and Elena would continue to suffer, while other families faced the same impossible choices. "There's more," Catherine added, pulling out another document. "We've conducted a preliminary investigation into your daughter's medical claims. There are some discrepancies in the timeline that suggest possible insurance fraud." "That's enough," Cheska said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd grown up in boardrooms. "Miss Blackstone, you're threatening to fabricate criminal charges against a sick child's father to prevent him from speaking about legitimate healthcare concerns. I'll be recording everything that happens from this point forward." Catherine's smile never wavered. "Of course, Miss Mendez. I'm simply ensuring that all parties understand the full scope of the situation before we proceed." The boardroom doors opened, and Victor Mendez emerged, a distinguished man in his 50s with graying temples and the confident bearing of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. His eyes softened when they settled on his daughter, then hardened when they moved to Richard. "Cheska, sweetheart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't we discuss this privately? I'm sure we can find a solution that doesn't require involving—" he gestures vaguely at Richard, "outside parties in our internal business decisions." "Dad, Richard isn't an outside party. He's been a loyal employee for 3 years, and his family is suffering because of policies you've implemented." Victor's expression grew troubled. "Cheska, I know you think you're helping, but business decisions aren't made based on individual sob stories. We have shareholders to consider, profit margins to maintain. If we gave every employee with a sick family member special treatment, we'd be bankrupt within a year. Dad, this isn't about special treatment. This is about basic human decency." "Mr. Mendez," Richard said quietly, finding his voice despite the intimidation tactics, "I don't want special treatment. I just want the chance to work hard and provide for my daughter without having to choose between her medicine and our rent." Victor studied Richard for a long moment. "Mr. Hernandez, I understand you're in a difficult situation, but surely you realize that Pinnacle Industries employs over 3,000 people in this region. Our success provides jobs, supports families, contributes to the local economy. Sometimes individual sacrifice is necessary for the greater good." "Whose greater good?" Richard asked, his voice growing stronger. "Your shareholders, who made $12 million in profits last quarter while my daughter rationed her pain medication? Your executive team, who spent $2.8 million on bonuses while Patricia Chen sold her wedding ring to pay for her son's speech therapy?" Victor's face flushed with anger. "How dare you question decisions you don't understand? You're a night janitor with a high school education. What could you possibly know about running a multinational corporation?" The dismissive tone triggered something in Richard that 3 years of quiet servitude hadn't prepared anyone for. "You're right, Mr. Mendez. I don't know anything about multinational corporations. But I know what it's like to lie awake at night, calculating whether I can afford both groceries and my daughter's medication. I know what it's like to watch a brilliant 8-year-old girl hide her pain because she's worried about adding to her father's stress. I know what it's like to clean these marble floors every night while your executives discuss cutting healthcare benefits as if we're talking about office supplies instead of human lives. Richard stepped forward, his janitor's uniform a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding them. I may not understand profit margins, Mr. Mendez, but I understand something you seem to have forgotten. Every number on your spreadsheet represents a real family with real struggles, and those families trusted Pinnacle Industries to provide fair compensation for honest work.
Cheska watched her father's face carefully, seeing emotions she hadn't witnessed since her mother's death 5 years earlier. Victor Mendez prided himself on being a self-made man who'd built his company through hard work and determination. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of the people whose labor made his success possible. "Mr. Hernandez," Victor said quietly, "what exactly are you asking for?" Before Richard could answer, the boardroom doors burst open and Tommy Rodriguez rushed in, still wearing his maintenance uniform and breathing heavily from running up 42 flights of stairs. "Richard, man, you need to see this." Tommy held up his phone, showing a live news feed. Channel 7 just broadcast the story about Elena, but it's not just about her. They've got interviews with 15 other Pinnacle families dealing with medical crises. The parking lot downstairs is filling up with employees and their families. People are demanding answers. Through the boardroom windows, they could see the crowd gathering below. Parents holding children, workers still in their uniforms, elderly couples supporting each other as they climbed the courthouse steps. Signs and banners had appeared as if from nowhere. "Elena deserves health care." "Pinnacle, stop profiting from pain." And "Health care for all Pinnacle families." Victor moved to the window, his face pale as he watched his employees, people he passed in hallways every day without really seeing, gathering to demand basic dignity and healthcare security. "My God," he whispered, "I had no idea it was this widespread." Cheska joined her father at the window. "Dad, this is what I've been trying to tell you. This isn't about one family or one sick child. This is about a system that treats human beings as disposable resources." Catherine Blackstone cleared her throat. "Mr. Mendez, the board members are waiting. We need to proceed with the scheduled meeting." Victor turned away from the window, looking older than he had moments before. "Yes, of course. Mr. Hernandez, Miss Rodriguez, you wanted to address the board. I think it's time we listened." As they walked toward the boardroom, Richard felt the weight of hundreds of families resting on his shoulders. In a few minutes, he would stand before the most powerful business leaders in Meridian Falls and speak for every parent who'd ever had to choose between their child's health and their family's financial survival. The moment of truth had arrived. The Pinnacle Industries boardroom was a temple to corporate power. 12 leather chairs surrounded a mahogany table that could have housed a small family, while oil paintings of former company leaders gazed down from gilded frames. Richard had cleaned this room hundreds of times, but standing at its threshold as something other than invisible help felt surreal. 11 board members sat in judgment, their collective net worth exceeding the GDP of small nations. At the head of the table, Victor Mendez gestured for Richard and Cheska to enter, while Catherine Blackstone positioned herself like a prosecutor preparing for trial. "Gentlemen," Victor announced, "my daughter has requested time to address some concerns about our employee benefit structure. Cheska, you have 15 minutes. 15 minutes to change a system decades in the making. Richard felt his palms sweat as he took the seat Cheska indicated beside her. Across the table, board member Harold Steinberg, owner of 3 car dealerships and a yacht that cost more than most people's homes, looked at Richard with undisguised disdain. "Before we begin," Steinberg interrupted, "I want it on record that this is highly irregular. We don't typically allow custodial staff to participate in executive meetings." "Mr. Steinberg," Cheska replied coolly, "Mr. Hernandez isn't here as custodial staff. He's here as a Pinnacle Industries employee whose family represents the human cost of our current policies." She opened her laptop and connected it to the room's presentation system. The first slide displayed a simple title: "The True Cost of Cutting Healthcare, a Financial and Moral Analysis." Gentlemen, over the past week, I've conducted comprehensive research into our employee benefit structure. What I've discovered isn't just morally unconscionable, it's financially destructive to our long-term success. The next slide showed a graph comparing Pinnacle's healthcare spending to industry standards. We currently spend 34% less on employee healthcare than our competitors. This might seem like savings, but the hidden costs are staggering. Board member William Crawford, a real estate mogul with political aspirations, leaned forward. "Cheska, where are you going with this? We've been through these numbers dozens of times." "Have we examined the turnover costs, Uncle William?" Cheska asked, using the familiar title that reminded everyone of her family connections. "In the past 18 months, we've lost 847 employees. The replacement and training costs alone exceed $12.3 million annually." Richard watched the board members' faces as Cheska methodically dismantled their assumptions. These weren't evil men, he realized. They were simply so removed from the reality of their employees' lives that human suffering had become an abstraction. "Furthermore," Cheska continued, "our current healthcare restrictions have created a productivity crisis. Employees are calling in sick 23% more frequently than industry average, not because they're malingering, but because they can't afford preventive care." "That's all very interesting in theory," Steinberg interrupted, "but we're not a charity, Cheska. We have fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders." Which brings me to my next point. Cheska's next slide showed profit projections. Companies with comprehensive employee health care show 18% higher productivity and 31% better employee retention. Our savings on health care are actually costing us millions in lost efficiency.
Board member Robert Hayes, who'd built his fortune in manufacturing, studied the projections with interest. "These numbers are compelling, Cheska, but they're also theoretical. We need concrete examples of how our current system affects real employees." "That's exactly why Mr. Hernandez is here," Cheska said, turning to Richard. "Richard, would you tell the board about Elena?" Richard stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The boardroom fell silent except for the distant sound of the growing crowd outside. He looked around the table at faces that had never known financial desperation, never calculated the cost of medicine against the cost of rent. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice barely above a whisper, then stronger. "3 days ago, my 8-year-old daughter collapsed during a school trip. The diagnosis was juvenile arthritis, a condition that requires $3,200 per month in treatment." He pulled out his phone and showed them Elena's photo from the telescope night. "This is Elena. She wants to be an astronomer because she says space is full of undiscovered possibilities. She's been hiding her pain for months because she heard me on the phone with the electric company trying to negotiate a payment plan." Richard's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Your insurance policy, the one that's supposed to protect families like mine, covers 40% of Elena's treatment. That leaves me responsible for $1,920 per month. My entire salary is $2,400. The room remained silent. Robert Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But Elena isn't the only one." Richard opened the folder Tommy had given him. "Patricia Chen's son needs speech therapy after an accident. Pinnacle approved 6 sessions. He needs 30. Maria Santos was fired last month after her daughter's leukemia treatments became too expensive for the company's liking." Richard pulled out page after page of medical bills, each one representing a family in crisis. Tommy Rodriguez's wife is rationing insulin. Janet Morrison's husband died last year because they couldn't afford his heart medication. 15 families have declared bankruptcy in the past year due to medical debt. "Mr. Hernandez,"
Crawford interrupted. "While these stories are unfortunate, you must understand that businesses can't be responsible for every employee's personal misfortunes." Personal misfortunes? Richard's voice carried 3 years of suppressed frustration. "Mr. Crawford, I spent 2 tours in Afghanistan protecting this country. I worked construction for 12 years, building homes and businesses that make communities stronger. I've never asked for handouts or special treatment. I've worked every day since I was 16 years old." Richard stepped closer to the table, his janitor's uniform suddenly seeming less like a symbol of low status and more like a badge of honest labor. "What I'm asking for isn't charity, it's basic human dignity. I'm asking for the chance to work full-time for a company and still be able to afford my child's medicine. I'm asking for healthcare coverage that actually covers healthcare." The boardroom door suddenly burst open, and Tommy Rodriguez entered with Patricia Chen and 6 other Pinnacle employees, all still in their work uniforms. "Mr. Mendez," Tommy said, addressing Victor directly, "we're sorry to interrupt, but the crowd outside is growing. There are over 300 employees down there, along with their families. Local news is interviewing people about their healthcare struggles." Through the boardroom windows, they could see news helicopters circling the building. The crowd had grown into a full demonstration, with employees sharing their stories on live television. "Dad," Cheska said quietly, "this isn't going away. This is a crisis of trust between Pinnacle Industries and the people who make this company successful." Victor moved to the window, watching his employees, people he thought of as satisfied and loyal, demanding basic healthcare security. A young mother was being interviewed while holding a toddler with visible medical equipment. An elderly man in a Pinnacle maintenance uniform was showing reporters prescription bottles while his wife wiped away tears. "Jesus," whispered board member Michael Torres, a hotel chain owner who joined Victor at the window. "I had no idea." Catherine Blackstone cleared her throat. "Mr. Mendez, from a legal standpoint, we should end this meeting immediately. The longer we allow this presentation to continue, the more we expose ourselves to liability." "What liability?" Victor asked sharply. "If we acknowledge that our healthcare policies are inadequate, we open ourselves to lawsuits from every employee who suffered financial hardship due to medical expenses." Richard felt the moment slipping away. The legal machinery was kicking in, ready to protect corporate interests while employees continued to suffer. "Mr. Mendez," Richard said, his voice cutting through the legal discussions, "I want you to imagine something. Tonight, when you go home to your mansion in Oak Ridge Estates, I want you to picture tucking your child into bed, knowing that if they get sick tomorrow, you'll have to choose between their medicine and your mortgage payment." The room fell silent. "I want you to imagine explaining to an 8-year-old girl why the company her father works for, the company he cleans every night while she sleeps, can afford $2.8 million in executive bonuses but can't afford to help her walk without pain." Richard looked directly at Victor. "Your daughter is fighting for us because she remembers what it means to see employees as human beings. The question is, do you?" Outside, the crowd began chanting, "Healthcare now! Healthcare now!" The sound echoed through the boardroom windows like a heartbeat, regular and insistent. Victor Mendez stood at the crossroads of his legacy, with his daughter's moral courage on one side and his board's financial fears on the other. The choice he made in the next few minutes would determine not just Elena's future, but the future of every family trusting Pinnacle Industries to treat them with basic human dignity. The room held its breath, waiting for his answer. Victor Mendez's silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The chanting from outside grew louder, punctuated by the whir of news helicopters circling the building. Richard watched the CEO's face, seeing a man grappling with the collision between profit margins and human decency. Finally, Victor spoke. "Mr. Hernandez, I appreciate your perspective,
But you're asking me to fundamentally restructure our entire benefits system based on emotional appeals rather than sound business principles. Richard felt his heart sink, but Victor wasn't finished. However, Victor continued, I'm willing to consider a compromise. We could establish a hardship fund for employees facing extraordinary medical expenses. Cases would be reviewed individually, and assistance would be provided on a case-by-case basis. The board members nodded approvingly. It sounded reasonable, compassionate even. But Cheska immediately recognized the trap. Dad, that's not a solution. It's a Band-Aid that puts desperate families at the mercy of corporate charity. What happens when the fund runs out? What happens when someone's illness doesn't meet the arbitrary criteria for extraordinary? Harold Steinberg leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades in business. Cheska, your father is offering more than any reasonable employer would provide. This young man should be grateful. Grateful? Richard's voice cracked with disbelief. Grateful for the chance to beg for my daughter's health care? Before anyone could respond, the boardroom door flew open again. This time it was Frank Walsh, Richard's supervisor, red-faced and furious. Mr. Mendez, sir, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a serious problem. This man, he pointed accusingly at Richard, abandoned his shift yesterday and has been spreading lies about the company to the media. Frank slammed a folder on the conference table. I have documentation here showing that Mr. Hernandez has been consistently negligent in his duties, missing areas during cleaning, taking unauthorized breaks, using company time for personal phone calls. Richard stared at the folder in shock. Frank, that's not true. You know my work record. What I know, Frank interrupted, is that you've been ungrateful for the job this company gave you when nobody else would hire a disabled veteran. Now you're biting the hand that feeds you. Catherine Blackstone smiled coldly as she opened Frank's folder. Mr. Hernandez, these performance reviews paint a very different picture from the one you've presented today. Multiple instances of insubordination, failure to complete assigned tasks, inappropriate behavior with executive staff. Richard's hands trembled as he looked at the fabricated documents. His signature had been forged on write-ups he'd never seen, performance evaluations he'd never received. They were manufacturing a case to destroy his credibility and his future employment prospects. Furthermore, Catherine continued, we've received concerning information about your daughter's medical claims. The timeline of her treatments doesn't align with your work schedule. It appears you may have been filing fraudulent insurance claims. The accusation hit Richard like a physical blow. They weren't just coming after his job. They were threatening Elena's access to health care by claiming insurance fraud. That's impossible, Richard said, his voice shaking. Every claim has been legitimate. Every doctor's appointment, every prescription. The investigation is ongoing, Catherine said dismissively. But I should warn you that insurance fraud is a federal crime, punishable by significant fines and imprisonment. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of the crowd chanting Elena's name. Richard realized with growing horror that Pinnacle's legal team had spent the morning constructing an elaborate frame-up designed to destroy him personally while discrediting his testimony about employee health care. Cheska stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is disgraceful. You're manufacturing evidence to silence a whistleblower and threatening to criminalize a sick child's medical treatment. Cheska, her father said warningly, you're overstepping. No, Dad, I'm finally seeing clearly. Cheska's voice carried a steel Richard had never heard before. This isn't about business principles or fiscal responsibility. This is about powerful people protecting their privileges by destroying anyone who challenges them. Board member Robert Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. Victor, this is getting out of hand. Perhaps we should table this discussion until emotions cool down. Emotions? Richard stood slowly, looking around the table at men who had never worried about affording medicine for their children.
You think this is about emotions? He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, putting it on speaker. Elena's voice filled the boardroom, weak but clear. Daddy, Mrs. Gonzalez said you're at your important meeting. Are you helping the other families like us? Richard's voice broke. Yes, sweetheart, I'm trying. Good, Elena said, with the simple faith of childhood. I told Mrs. Gonzalez that you're the bravest person I know. Even when your leg hurts, you still take care of everyone. There was a pause. Then Elena added, Daddy, my medicine ran out this morning. Mrs. Gonzalez said we should wait for you to come home before we call the doctor. The call ended, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence. Elena's medication had run out, and Richard was here fighting for healthcare policy while his daughter sat at home without pain relief. I have to go, Richard said, moving toward the door. My daughter needs me. Mr. Hernandez, Catherine called out, if you leave this building, consider yourself terminated from Pinnacle Industries, and the insurance fraud investigation will proceed immediately. Richard stopped at the threshold, his hand on the door handle. Walking out meant losing his job, his insurance, and possibly facing criminal charges. Staying meant abandoning Elena when she needed him most. Furthermore, Catherine continued, leaving now would be considered an admission of guilt regarding the performance issues we've documented. No employer in Meridian Falls would hire someone with your record. Richard felt the walls closing in. They had engineered a perfect trap. Stay and be complicit in a system that was killing his daughter, or leave and lose everything. The crowd outside began chanting louder, "Healthcare now! Healthcare now! Justice for Elena!"
Tommy Rodriguez appeared in the doorway behind Richard. Man, you need to see this, he said urgently. Channel 7 just broadcast Elena's story. Her picture is on every local station. People are driving in from 3 counties to support her. Through the boardroom windows, they could see the parking lot filling with cars. Families were arriving with their own signs, their own stories of medical bankruptcies and denied treatments. What had started as a small employee gathering was becoming a regional uprising. Dad, Cheska said quietly, if you let them destroy Richard like this, Pinnacle Industries will never recover from the public relations nightmare. But more importantly, you'll never recover from knowing you could have helped a sick child and chose not to. Victor looked out at the growing crowd, then at the fraudulent documents Catherine had prepared, then at his daughter's tear-filled eyes. For the first time in his corporate career, he seemed genuinely uncertain about what to do. Harold Steinberg stood abruptly. Victor, this has gone far enough. I'm calling for an immediate vote to end this meeting and terminate Mr. Hernandez's employment effective immediately. Seconded, said William Crawford. All in favor? Steinberg called out. 6 hands rose around the table. Richard watched his last hope crumble as the board voted to destroy him. Elena was at home without medicine. The legal system was being weaponized against his family, and he was about to lose the job that barely kept them afloat. But then Victor Mendez did something that surprised everyone in the room. Motion denied, he said quietly. Victor, you can't deny a properly seconded motion, Steinberg protested. I can when it's my company, Victor replied, his voice growing stronger. And I can when it's about to destroy the last shred of decency this corporation has left. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the hundreds of families gathering to support a janitor's sick daughter. Gentlemen, I built this company on the principle that hard work should be rewarded with security and dignity. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. Victor turned back to face the room. Mr. Hernandez, I'm not going to let them destroy you, but I need you to help me fix this. Not just for Elena, but for every family counting on us to do the right thing. The ordeal was far from over, but for the first time since entering the boardroom, Richard felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. The stunned silence that followed Victor's defiance of the board vote was broken by Harold Steinberg's chair scraping violently against the floor as he stood.
Victor, have you lost your mind? You can't just override a board decision because you're having an emotional moment. Actually, Harold, I can. Victor's voice carried a quiet authority that reminded everyone why he'd built Pinnacle Industries from a small family business into a regional powerhouse. I still own 51% of this company's voting shares. What I can't do is continue pretending that our healthcare policies aren't destroying the lives of the people who made our success possible. Catherine Blackstone's face flushed red. Mr. Mendez, if you proceed with any changes to our benefit structure without proper legal review, you'll expose the company to massive liability. I strongly advise. Miss Blackstone, Victor interrupted, your services are no longer required. Security will escort you from the building. The head of legal affairs looked as if she'd been slapped. Victor, you can't fire me for providing sound legal counsel. I'm firing you for fabricating evidence against an employee whose only crime was asking for health care for his sick daughter. Victor pressed a button on the conference table phone. Security, to the executive boardroom, please. As they waited, Victor turned to Frank Walsh, who had been standing near the door looking increasingly uncomfortable. Frank, how long have you worked for Pinnacle? 18 years, sir. Started in maintenance, worked my way up to facilities supervisor. And in those 18 years, has Richard Hernandez ever given you cause to write a negative performance review? Frank shifted nervously, avoiding Richard's eyes. Well, sir, there have been some recent issues. Frank, Victor's voice cut through the evasion like a blade. Yes or no? The facility supervisor looked around the room at the board members, then at Catherine Blackstone, then finally at Richard. No, sir. Richard's always been one of our most reliable employees. Those write-ups, they weren't my idea. The confession hung in the air like an indictment. Catherine had orchestrated the entire character assassination, using Frank's position to create fraudulent documentation. Who instructed you to create false performance reviews? Victor asked. Frank glanced nervously at Catherine, who was gathering her documents with sharp, angry movements. Miss Blackstone called me this morning, said the company needed to protect itself from a potential lawsuit. She said Richard was planning to cause trouble and that we needed documentation to justify preemptive action. Richard felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. They had planned to destroy him before he'd even entered the boardroom. Security arrived and quietly escorted Catherine Blackstone from the building, her threats of legal action echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors closed. With the chief architect of the cover-up gone, the boardroom atmosphere shifted dramatically. Robert Hayes, who had been studying his hands throughout the confrontation, finally looked up. Victor, I owe you an apology. And Mr. Hernandez, I owe you an even bigger one. Hayes stood and extended his hand to Richard. 30 years ago, I started my first business with a loan I could barely afford. I told myself I'd never forget what it felt like to worry about making payroll, about taking care of my employees. Somewhere along the way, I did forget.
William Crawford, Victor's brother-in-law, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Victor, even if we agree that our healthcare policies need adjustment, we can't just tear up our entire benefit structure overnight. There are contracts, obligations to shareholders. Uncle William, Cheska interjected, what obligations do we have to Elena Hernandez, to Patricia Chen's son, to all the families who trusted us to provide fair compensation for honest work? Before William could respond, Tommy Rodriguez's voice came from the doorway where he'd been quietly observing. If I may, Mr. Mendez, there's something else you should know. Victor nodded for him to continue. This morning, after the news broke about Elena's story, something incredible started happening. Pinnacle employees began calling in to pledge money for a medical fund. Not just a few people, hundreds of them. Day shift, night shift, maintenance, office workers, even some of the mid-level managers. Tommy pulled out his phone and showed the screen to the room. As of an hour ago, we've raised $47,000 for Elena's treatment. But here's the thing. People aren't just giving money. They're sharing their own stories about medical bankruptcies, about choosing between medicine and rent, about kids who can't get the care they need. He scrolled through message after message from Pinnacle employees. Sarah in accounting says her diabetic son has been rationing insulin for 6 months. Mike from the loading dock has been working overtime to pay for his wife's cancer treatments that insurance won't cover. Jennifer from HR, Mr. Mendez, had to set up a GoFundMe last year when her daughter needed surgery. The revelation that even human resources personnel were struggling with healthcare costs sent a visible shock through the remaining board members. There's more, Tommy continued. Local businesses are starting to call. Martinez Construction, Valley Electronics, even some of our competitors. They want to know if they can contribute to a regional healthcare assistance fund. This story isn't just about Pinnacle anymore. It's about an entire community coming together to fix a broken system. Victor moved to the window again, watching the crowd that now stretched across the entire plaza. News crews were interviewing employees, but also local business owners, teachers, healthcare workers, and families from across Meridian Falls. "My God," he whispered, "what have we created?" Michael Torres, who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke. "Victor, I think what we've created is an opportunity, not just to fix our own policies, but to lead a regional transformation in how businesses treat their employees." He stood and joined Victor at the window. "Look at that crowd. Those aren't just protesters, they're customers, voters, community members. If we handle this right, if we become the first major employer in the region to implement truly comprehensive healthcare benefits, we won't just be doing the right thing morally, we'll be setting a competitive advantage that other companies will struggle to match." Richard watched this transformation in real time, seeing corporate executives begin to understand that treating employees well wasn't just morally correct, it was good business. Harold Steinberg, however, wasn't convinced. "This is all very idealistic, but the costs will be enormous. We're talking about potentially tripling our healthcare expenditures." "Actually, no," Cheska said, opening her laptop again. "I've been running projections all week. If we implement comprehensive healthcare coverage, eliminate medical copays for chronic conditions, and establish a family healthcare fund, our total additional costs would be approximately $8.3 million annually." She clicked to the next slide. "Last year, we spent $12.8 million on executive bonuses, $6.2 million on corporate retreats and entertainment, and $4.1 million on the renovation of this executive floor alone. We have the money. We've just been choosing to spend it on luxuries instead of necessities." The numbers hung in the air like an indictment of corporate priorities. Robert Hayes broke the silence. "Cheska's right. We've been spending money on marble countertops and crystal chandeliers while our employees' children go without medicine. Furthermore," Cheska continued, "the productivity gains from comprehensive healthcare would likely offset much of the cost within 18 months. Healthy employees work more efficiently, take fewer sick days, and stay with companies longer." Victor turned back to the room, his decision crystallizing. "Richard, I want to offer you something more than just healthcare. I want to offer you a position as Director of Employee Welfare, working directly with Cheska to implement comprehensive benefit reforms across the entire company." Richard stared at him in shock. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not qualified for an executive position. I'm a janitor." "No," Victor said firmly, "you're a man who understands what our employees actually need, because you've lived their struggles. You're a father who's willing to risk everything to protect not just his own child, but all the children whose parents work for this company. That's exactly the qualification this position requires." Tommy Rodriguez began clapping, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. The sound echoed through the boardroom as one by one, even former opponents like Robert Hayes and Michael Torres joined in the applause. Outside, the crowd had begun chanting again, but this time the words were different. "Thank you, Pinnacle! Thank you, Pinnacle!" Richard looked around the boardroom at faces that had completely transformed over the course of 2 hours. Men who had entered ready to fire him were now applauding his promotion to executive leadership. But the most important transformation was yet to come, turning these promises into reality for hundreds of families counting on Pinnacle Industries to finally live up to its responsibilities. The revelation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Richard Hernandez stood in an office that had been hastily converted from a storage room on the 37th floor. The space wasn't much: a desk salvaged from surplus furniture, 2 mismatched chairs, and a window that looked out over the employee parking lot where he'd walked for 3 years as an invisible night janitor. But the nameplate on his desk read Richard Hernandez, Director of Employee Welfare, and those words still felt surreal every time he saw them. Elena's medication had stabilized her condition dramatically. The specialized treatment Dr. Whitfield had prescribed was working, and for the first time in months, Richard's daughter was running and playing like a normal 8-year-old. That morning, she'd shown him a new drawing, not a stick figure family this time, but a detailed sketch of Saturn with the note, "For Dad's new office," written in her careful handwriting. "Knock, knock," came Cheska's voice from the doorway. She entered carrying 2 coffee cups and a thick folder of paperwork. "How's our first Director of Employee Welfare adjusting to executive life?" Richard gestured at his cramped office with a self-deprecating smile. "Well, the commute's shorter, and I get to see daylight during work hours, though I have to admit I miss the peaceful quiet of night cleaning sometimes." "Trust me, once we start implementing these reforms, you'll long for those quiet nights." Cheska set down 1 coffee cup and opened her folder. "We've got our work cut out for us. I've been fielding calls from employees all morning, some excited about the changes, others skeptical that anything will actually improve." Richard understood the skepticism. He'd worked for companies before that made grand promises during crisis moments, only to quietly abandon them once public attention faded. "What's our timeline looking like?" "Fast," Cheska said, spreading documents across his small desk. "Dad wants the new healthcare policy implemented within 60 days. The board approved emergency funding yesterday, $12 million for the first year, with automatic increases tied to company profits." She pointed to a detailed implementation chart. "Phase 1 starts Monday. Immediate elimination of copays for chronic conditions, prescription coverage expansion to 95%, and establishment of the emergency medical fund. Phase 2 begins next month. Comprehensive family coverage, mental health benefits, and the child care assistance program." Richard studied the documents, still amazed that policies he'd only dreamed about were becoming reality. What about the other companies? Tommy mentioned that local businesses were interested in participating. That's where things get really interesting. Cheska pulled out her laptop and showed him a map of Meridian Falls with dozens of business locations marked in green. 17 local companies have committed to adopting similar healthcare policies. Martinez Construction is implementing our exact benefits package for their 200 employees. Valley Electronics is going even further. They're adding paid family medical leave. She clicked to another screen showing financial projections. The Regional Chamber of Commerce is calling it the Meridian Falls Healthcare Initiative. They think it could make our area the most employee-friendly business district in the state, attracting top talent and new companies. A knock at the door interrupted their planning session. Tommy Rodriguez entered, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were Patricia Chen, Janet Morrison, and 6 other Pinnacle employees, all carrying flowers, carts, and small gifts. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important," Tommy said with a grin, "but we wanted to celebrate our new director's first successful week." Patricia stepped forward, her usual reserved demeanor replaced by genuine warmth. "Richard, my son had his first speech therapy session yesterday, fully covered, no copay. He was so excited that he called you his word hero because you helped him get his voice back." Janet Morrison, whose husband had died the previous year partly due to unaffordable medication, wiped away tears as she spoke. "I know it's too late for my Daniel, but knowing that other families won't have to make the choices we made, it means everything." The small office filled with stories of immediate impact. Maria Santos had been quietly rehired with back pay and a formal apology. Families were scheduling preventive care appointments they'd been postponing for years. Children were getting needed therapies and treatments. "There's something else." Tommy said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "We've been talking among ourselves, the maintenance crew, security, kitchen staff, all the departments that don't usually have a voice in company decisions. We want to propose something." He pulled out a handwritten document signed by over 100 employees. "We want to establish a formal employee advocacy council. Representatives from every department meeting monthly with you and Miss Mendez to identify problems before they become crises." Richard read through the proposal, impressed by its thoughtfulness and detail. "This is incredible. You've basically designed a system to make sure what happened to Elena's family never happens to anyone else." "That's exactly the point," Patricia said. "You risked everything to speak up for us. Now we want to make sure you have the support structure to keep fighting for employees who might not have your courage." Cheska reviewed the proposal over Richard's shoulder. "I love this. Dad will need to approve it, but I can't imagine him objecting to more employee input." As the group prepared to leave, Tommy lingered behind. "Richard, man, there's one more thing. The guys from night shift, we know you miss the work sometimes. If you ever want to grab a mop and join us for old times, you're always welcome." After everyone left, Richard sat alone in his office, overwhelmed by the transformation of his life and his relationships with colleagues. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Daddy, Mrs. Patterson says I'm the best student astronomer she's ever had. Tonight, can we look for new planets?"
As Richard prepared to leave for the day, a luxury he'd never had during his night shift years, Cheska returned with one final surprise. "Before you go home to Elena, there's someone here to see you." She stepped aside to reveal Dr. Sarah Whitfield, carrying a medical chart and wearing a broad smile. "Mr. Hernandez, or should I say Director Hernandez, I have some wonderful news about Elena's latest test results." Richard's heart skipped. Is everything okay? More than okay. Elena's response to the new treatment protocol has been remarkable. Her inflammatory markers are at the lowest levels we've seen since her diagnosis. More importantly, the joint damage we were worried about has actually begun to reverse. Dr. Whitfield opened Elena's chart, showing before and after X-rays. 6 months ago, I was concerned about Elena's long-term mobility. Today, I can confidently say that with continued treatment, she should have no limitations on her activities. She can run, play sports, even pursue that astronomy career she talks about constantly. Richard felt tears well up in his eyes. "Doctor, what you're telling me is that Elena will be completely normal?" "Elena will be Elena," Dr. Whitfield said gently, "a brilliant, determined little girl who happens to have a manageable medical condition and a father who moved mountains to ensure she gets the care she needs." That evening, Richard arrived home to find Elena in their small backyard with her telescope, carefully tracking the movement of Jupiter across the twilight sky. She looked up as he approached, her face glowing with excitement. "Daddy, come see! Jupiter has 4 moons and I can see 3 of them tonight." As Richard knelt beside his daughter, adjusting the telescope focus the way she'd taught him, Elena looked up with the serious expression she wore when discussing important matters. "Daddy, Mrs. Gonzalez told me about your new job. She said you're helping families like ours now." "That's right, sweetheart. I'm trying to make sure other kids don't have to worry about affording their medicine." Elena nodded solemnly, then brightened. "That's good. But, Daddy, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." "Even when I was hurting, even when we didn't have enough money, I was never scared, because I knew my daddy would find a way to take care of me." She hugged him tightly. "You were always my hero, even before you got the important job." As father and daughter returned to stargazing, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey from that desperate night in the hospital to this moment of hope and security. He'd discovered that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest act, one person refusing to accept that suffering is inevitable. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, each one a distant sun, perhaps warming planets where other fathers looked up at the sky and dreamed of better tomorrows for their children. Tonight, under the clear skies of Meridian Falls, that tomorrow had finally arrived.
3 months after that historic board meeting, Pinnacle Industries faced its ultimate test. The quarterly shareholders meeting was about to convene, and not everyone was pleased with Victor Mendez's transformation of company priorities. Richard sat in the employee break room, adjusting his tie and reviewing the presentation notes he'd prepared for what would be the most important speech of his career. "You ready for this?" Cheska asked, entering with 2 cups of coffee and her own stack of financial documents. "The shareholders have been asking pointed questions about our increased healthcare spending. Some are threatening to force a vote of no confidence against Dad." Richard nodded grimly. He'd been expecting this confrontation since the day Victor promoted him. While Pinnacle's employees celebrated their improved benefits, the company's major investors had watched their quarterly profits decrease by 4.2% and weren't happy about the unnecessary expenditures on employee welfare. How bad is the opposition? Led by Harrison Blackwood, Catherine Blackstone's father. He owns 12% of company shares and has been rallying other investors around what he calls fiscal responsibility. He's demanding my father reverse all healthcare improvements and return to previous benefit levels. Cheska set down her coffee and pulled out her laptop. But here's what Harrison doesn't know and what we're going to reveal today. Our productivity numbers for the past quarter have been extraordinary. The screen displayed graphs showing dramatic improvements across every measurable metric. Employee sick days down 31%. Turnover rate decreased from 23% to 8%. Productivity per employee increased 19%. Customer satisfaction scores at an all-time high. Richard studied the numbers, still amazed by how quickly comprehensive healthcare had transformed the workplace. "What about recruitment? You mentioned we were having trouble filling positions before." "We now have a waiting list of 400 qualified applicants. Word has spread throughout the region that Pinnacle is the place to work if you want real job security and family protection." A knock at the break room door interrupted their preparation. Tommy Rodriguez entered, followed by Patricia Chen, Janet Morrison, and Maria Santos, along with 15 other employees Richard didn't immediately recognize. "Sorry to interrupt," Tommy said, "but these folks wanted to meet you before the big meeting." He gestured to the group behind him. "These are new hires from the past 2 months. Every one of them left other jobs specifically to work for Pinnacle because of the healthcare policies you helped create." A young woman stepped forward, extending her hand to Richard. "Mr. Hernandez, I'm Ashley Martinez. I quit my job at Riverside Insurance to work here as a data analyst. My son has autism, and their insurance wouldn't cover his therapy. Pinnacle's coverage means he can get the help he needs." An older man joined her. "I'm David Chen, Patricia's husband, actually. I left my management position at Valley Manufacturing because Pinnacle's family healthcare plan covers my wife's medical needs and my mother's long-term care. Companies are starting to compete for employees by offering better benefits, and it's all because of what you started here." One by one, the new employees shared their stories. A single mother who could finally afford her daughter's asthma medication. A veteran whose PTSD treatment was fully covered. A young couple who no longer had to choose between starting a family and maintaining health insurance. "There's something else," Patricia added. "The Employee Advocacy Council has been tracking our impact beyond Pinnacle. 23 companies in the region have improved their healthcare benefits, trying to compete with us. We estimate that over 8,000 families now have better medical coverage because of what happened in that boardroom 3 months ago." Richard felt the weight of responsibility and pride in equal measure. What had started as a desperate plea for his daughter's medicine had become a regional transformation affecting thousands of families. "That's exactly what we need to present to the shareholders," Cheska said, taking notes as employees shared their stories. Concrete evidence that treating employees well isn't just morally right, it's a competitive advantage. The intercom crackled to life. "All shareholders and invited guests, please report to Conference Hall A for the quarterly meeting." As they prepared to leave, Elena appeared in the doorway, still wearing her school uniform and carrying her astronomy textbook. Mrs. Gonzalez had brought her directly from school so she could attend the meeting that would determine whether Pinnacle's healthcare reforms would continue. "Daddy, are you nervous about your speech?" Richard knelt down to Elena's level. "A little bit, sweetheart. Some people think we're spending too much money helping families like ours." Elena considered this with the serious expression she wore when solving difficult problems. "Daddy, remember what you taught me about stars? How they seem small from far away, but up close they're actually enormous and full of light." "I remember." "Maybe those people just need to get closer. Maybe they need to meet Patricia's son, who can talk better now, or Ashley's son, who can learn better, or all the kids who don't hurt anymore because their parents can afford medicine." Richard hugged his daughter tightly, amazed once again by her wisdom. "Elena, you're absolutely right. Sometimes people need to see up close what their decisions really mean." The walk to Conference Hall A felt like a march to battle. The hallway was lined with Pinnacle employees who had taken time off to attend the meeting. Not just the day shift workers Richard knew, but night custodians, security guards, kitchen staff, and maintenance crews who had never been invited to a shareholders meeting before. Conference Hall A was packed beyond capacity. Shareholders in expensive suits occupied the front rows, while employees and their families filled every available seat. Local news cameras lined the back wall, and Richard spotted reporters from 3 major newspapers taking notes. Harrison Blackwood commanded attention at the front of the room, a silver-haired man in his 70s whose bearing suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. He was deep in conversation with a group of shareholders, occasionally gesturing toward the employee section with obvious disdain. Victor Mendez took the podium, looking older than Richard remembered, but carrying himself with quiet dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending today's extraordinary shareholders meeting. We're here to address concerns about Pinnacle Industries' recent policy changes and their impact on company profitability." Harrison Blackwood immediately stood. "Victor, before we begin, I want to make something clear. The investors I represent are deeply concerned about the direction this company has taken. Spending millions on employee benefits while profits decline is not sustainable business practice. Harrison, you'll have your opportunity to present your position. But first, I'd like our Director of Employee Welfare to share some data that might surprise you." Richard stood slowly, Elena's words about stars echoing in his mind. As he walked to the podium, he passed rows of employees whose lives had been transformed by healthcare security, shareholders whose investments had funded that transformation, and his daughter who watched with absolute faith that her father would find the right words. At the podium, Richard looked out at the crowded room and realized that this moment would determine not just Pinnacle's future, but whether corporate America could embrace the radical idea that taking care of employees was actually good business. The ultimate test of everything they'd built was about to begin. Richard gripped the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, some hostile, some hopeful, all waiting for him to justify the most expensive gamble in Pinnacle Industries history. His prepared notes suddenly felt inadequate for the magnitude of this moment. "3 months ago," Richard began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I stood in a different room in this building, asking not for charity, but for the chance to work hard and still afford my daughter's medicine. Today, I want to share what happened when this company chose to see employees as human beings instead of line items on a budget." He clicked to his first slide, showing a photograph of Elena at her telescope. "This is my daughter Elena. Her juvenile arthritis required $3,200 monthly in treatment. Under Pinnacle's previous insurance plan, my family was responsible for $1,920 of that cost, more than 80% of my monthly salary." Harrison Blackwood shifted impatiently in his seat, but Richard continued. "What I learned that day wasn't just about healthcare. It was about the hidden costs of treating employees as disposable resources." Richard advanced to his next slide, showing productivity statistics. Before healthcare reform, Pinnacle lost an average of 23% of its workforce annually. Training replacement employees cost us $14,600 per departure. That's $12.3 million yearly just in turnover costs. Murmurs rippled through the shareholder section as they saw the numbers for the first time. We also had the highest injury rate in our industry sector, not because our facilities were dangerous, but because employees delayed reporting problems, worked while sick, and avoided preventive care they couldn't afford. Richard's next slide showed workers' compensation claims. Last year alone, delayed medical intervention cost Pinnacle $4.7 million in extended disability payments and workplace injury settlements. Harrison Blackwood stood abruptly. Mr. Hernandez, these historical figures are interesting, but they don't justify the millions we're now spending on expanded benefits. You're absolutely right, Mr. Blackwood. Historical figures don't justify current spending. Current results do. Richard smiled, clicking to a dramatically different set of charts. Since implementing comprehensive healthcare, employee turnover has dropped to 8%. That's a savings of $9.2 million annually in replacement and training costs alone. The conference room fell silent as shareholders absorbed the implications. Workplace injuries are down 41% because employees seek preventive care instead of working through pain. Workers' compensation claims have decreased by 67%, saving an additional $3.1 million yearly. But here's the number that should matter most to everyone in this room. Richard's final slide showed profit projections extending 2 years into the future. Employee productivity has increased 19% across all departments. Customer satisfaction scores have reached record highs because our workers are healthier, more stable, and more committed to excellence. Despite our initial healthcare investment, Pinnacle Industries is projected to increase profits by 12% over the next 18 months. Spontaneous applause erupted from the employee section, but Richard raised his hand for quiet. However, the most significant return on investment can't be measured in dollars. Richard gestured toward the employee section. "Ashley Martinez, would you please stand?" The young woman rose, her face flushed with nervousness, but her voice clear. "My son Jake was falling behind in school because his autism went untreated under our previous insurance. Since joining Pinnacle, Jake has received comprehensive behavioral therapy. His teacher says he's now reading above grade level and has made his first real friendships." "Thank you, Ashley." Patricia Chen. Patricia stood with quiet dignity. "My son's speech therapy has given him confidence he never had before. Last week, he raised his hand in class for the first time. But more importantly, my family isn't drowning in medical debt anymore. We're planning for his college education instead of bankruptcy." One by one, Richard called upon employees to share their stories. Maria Santos spoke about returning to work with dignity after being rehired. Tommy Rodriguez explained how his wife's diabetes management had improved dramatically with proper medication access. Janet Morrison, whose husband had died partly due to unaffordable medicine, talked about the peace of knowing other families wouldn't face the same impossible choices. As each story unfolded, Richard watched the shareholders' faces. He saw recognition dawning in some eyes, the realization that business decisions affect real families with real struggles. Harrison Blackwood's expression had shifted from dismissive anger to uncomfortable acknowledgement. When the employee testimonials concluded, he stood slowly. "Mr. Hernandez, while these personal stories are touching, I remain concerned about the precedent we're setting. If every company in America implemented similar policies, the economic impact would be substantial." "You're absolutely right again, Mr. Blackwood. The economic impact would be substantial, substantially positive." He clicked to a new presentation prepared specifically for this objection. 23 companies in our region have already improved their benefits packages to compete with Pinnacle for top talent. The result? Regional unemployment has dropped to 3.2%, the lowest in state history. Local healthcare systems report 34% fewer emergency room visits for routine care. Consumer spending in Meridian Falls has increased 8% as families have more disposable income. Richard's voice gained strength as he continued. "We haven't just improved our company, Mr. Blackwood. We've improved our entire community.
And that community is responding by supporting businesses that demonstrate social responsibility. Cheska stood from her seat in the front row. If I may add one more point, the marketing value of our healthcare initiative has been extraordinary. We've received over $2.3 million worth of positive media coverage. Our brand recognition has increased 45% regionally, and we're receiving partnership inquiries from companies that want to be associated with our values. Victor Mendez rose to address the room. Harrison, I understand your concerns about profit margins and shareholder returns, but I built this company on the principle that success should be shared with the people who make it possible. The numbers prove that treating employees well isn't just morally right, it's the smartest business strategy we've ever implemented. Harrison Blackwood looked around the room, at shareholders reviewing the financial projections, at employees whose lives had been transformed, at his own colleagues who seemed swayed by the evidence. Victor, he said finally, I came here today prepared to demand the resignation of your leadership team and the immediate reversal of these policies. He paused, consulting his notes. But I'm looking at profit projections that show sustainable growth, productivity improvements that exceed industry standards, and brand recognition that money can't buy. The conference room held its breath.
I'm also looking at something else. A room full of employees who would walk through fire for this company because this company walked through fire for them. Harrison straightened his papers with resignation. I withdraw my motion of no confidence. Pinnacle Industries should continue its current healthcare policies. The eruption of applause was immediate and overwhelming. Employees cheered, shareholders clapped with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and even the news cameras captured the moment when corporate America chose humanity over pure profit. Richard felt Elena's arms wrap around his waist as she ran to the podium. "Daddy, you did it! You helped everyone!" But as Richard hugged his daughter and watched the celebration around them, he realized that the real victory wasn't in changing Harrison Blackwood's mind or securing shareholder approval. The real victory was in proving that businesses could succeed by taking care of their people, and that one person's courage to speak truth to power could transform an entire community. The reward wasn't just Elena's health, or Richard's promotion, or even Pinnacle's improved profits. The reward was the knowledge that thousands of families would sleep better tonight knowing their health care was secure, their dignity was respected, and their contributions were valued. Sometimes the greatest returns on investment couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. They could only be measured in the quality of life they made possible for ordinary people doing extraordinary work. 1 year later, Richard Hernandez stood at the same window where he'd once watched the city lights while mopping floors as an invisible night janitor. Now, from his spacious corner office on the 38th floor, he looked down at the Pinnacle Industries Employee Wellness Center, a brand new facility that had been constructed in the former parking lot, complete with an on-site medical clinic, childcare center, and fitness facility. Still seems surreal, doesn't it? Cheska's voice came from behind him as she entered with the morning's agenda. As newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, she'd earned her promotion through the measurable success of their employee welfare initiatives that had become a case study taught in business schools across the country. Every day, Richard admitted, adjusting his tie, a ritual that still felt foreign after a lifetime of work uniforms. Sometimes I look out this window and expect to see my old self down there with a mop bucket. Elena burst through the office door with the boundless energy of a healthy 9-year-old, her school backpack decorated with NASA patches and planet stickers. "Daddy, Miss Rodriguez says my science project won the regional competition. I get to present it at the state fair." Richard knelt to hug his daughter, marveling as he did every day at her vibrant health. Elena's arthritis was completely under control, and she'd grown 3 inches in the past year, making up for the growth her illness had previously stunted. Her latest project, Juvenile Arthritis and Space Exploration, How Medical Advances Help Astronauts, had impressed judges with its sophisticated understanding of both conditions. "That's incredible, sweetheart. What's your prize?" "A full scholarship to space camp this summer."
Elena's eyes sparkled with excitement. "And Daddy, guess what? They want to feature my project in Young Scientists magazine because I talked about how getting proper medicine helped me think clearly enough to study astronomy." Cheska smiled, updating her tablet. "Elena, you might be interested to know that your dad's employee wellness program has been nominated for the National Corporate Responsibility Award. The ceremony is next month in Washington, D.C." "Really?" Elena looked between her father and Cheska with amazement. "Daddy, you're going to meet the president." "We don't know about that yet," Richard laughed, "but it would be quite an honor." Tommy Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, wearing a crisp supervisor's uniform. His promotion to facilities director had come with Richard's transition to executive leadership, and he'd proved as capable in management as he was loyal as a friend. "Richard, the morning department heads meeting is about to start, but first you should see this." Tommy handed him a newspaper, the Meridian Falls Gazette, with a front-page story titled "The Hernandez Effect: How One Father's Courage Transformed Regional Healthcare." The article featured interviews with CEOs from across the tri-state area, all describing how Pinnacle's success had forced them to reconsider their own employee benefit structures. Companies in manufacturing, retail, healthcare, and technology had implemented similar programs, creating what economists were calling the Meridian Falls model of employee-centric business practices. "Listen to this," Richard read aloud. "Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Economic Development Specialist at State University, estimates that the regional transformation initiated by Pinnacle Industries has created over 2,000 new jobs, reduced healthcare costs by $47 million annually, and increased average household income by 8% across our tri-county area." The article continued with testimonials from families whose lives had been changed by the ripple effect of Richard's original stand. A teacher whose asthmatic daughter could now participate in sports. A factory worker whose diabetic wife had regained her sight through proper treatment. Dozens of children who were thriving because their parents could afford both medicine and adequate nutrition. "There's more," Tommy said, pulling out his phone. "Channel 7 called this morning. They want to do a one-year anniversary special about Elena's story and the changes it sparked. They're calling it From Janitor to Justice, the Richard Hernandez story." Elena clapped her hands excitedly. "Daddy, you're going to be famous." "I think I prefer being helpful to being famous," Richard said, but he couldn't hide his pride. The media attention had been overwhelming at times, but it had also amplified their message that employee welfare wasn't just morally right, it was good business.
Mrs. Gonzalez appeared in the doorway, now officially employed as the Employee Wellness Center's Family Services Coordinator. At 72, she'd found new purpose helping other families navigate healthcare systems and childcare resources. "Mijo," she said to Richard, "the delegation from Sacramento is here for the morning tour. They want to see how our childcare integration works before they implement similar programs in California." Richard checked his watch, another reminder of how dramatically his life had changed. A year ago, he'd owned a single digital watch bought at a discount store. Now he wore a gift from Victor Mendez, a Rolex inscribed with "For Richard Hernandez," proof that heroes come in all uniforms. "Elena, you need to get to school," Richard said, kissing his daughter's forehead. "Mrs. Patterson is expecting your presentation practice today." "Okay, but Daddy, can I ask you something?" "Always." Elena's expression grew serious, the way it did when she was pondering something important. "Do you ever miss cleaning the buildings at night? You used to say it was peaceful." Richard considered the question carefully. He did miss the quiet contemplation of night shift work, the satisfaction of transforming messy spaces into pristine environments, the simple clarity of tasks that had obvious beginnings and endings. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But Elena, I've learned that there are different kinds of cleaning. Now, instead of cleaning buildings, I help clean up systems that weren't working fairly for families like ours." Elena nodded sagely, like cleaning up unfairness instead of cleaning up dirt. "Exactly like that."
After Elena left for school with Mrs. Gonzalez, Richard and Cheska walked toward the conference room where department heads waited for their weekly coordination meeting. They passed the employee recognition wall, where photographs and stories celebrated workers whose dedication and innovation had contributed to Pinnacle's continued success. "Richard," Cheska said as they walked, "I have some news that I wanted to share privately first. Dad's announcing his retirement next month. The board has unanimously approved his recommendation that I become CEO." Richard stopped walking, processing the magnitude of this news. "Cheska, that's incredible. You've more than earned it." "There's more. He's also recommending that you be promoted to Executive Vice President of Human Development, with oversight of all employee welfare programs regionally. Basically, you'd be responsible for helping other companies implement the Meridian Falls model." The offer was staggering, a role that would make Richard one of the most influential corporate executives in the region, with the power to transform working conditions for tens of thousands of families. "I'm honored," Richard said slowly, "but I need to think about what's best for Elena, for our family." "Of course, take all the time you need." As they entered the conference room, Richard looked around the table at faces that had become deeply familiar over the past year. Department heads who had once seen him only as the night janitor now sought his input on policies affecting thousands of employees. The transformation still amazed him. But the greatest transformation wasn't in his title or salary. It was in the knowledge that his willingness to speak up for Elena had created lasting change that would protect other families for generations to come. That evening, Richard and Elena sat in their backyard, not the small apartment yard where they'd once worried about affording rent, but the garden behind their new home in Oak Ridge Estates, purchased with Richard's executive salary and Elena's future college fund fully secured. Elena had her telescope set up, tracking the path of Saturn across the autumn sky. "Daddy, look, Saturn's rings are perfectly visible tonight." As Richard peered through the telescope, Elena asked, "Do you think there are families on other planets looking at stars and wishing for better lives?" "Maybe, sweetheart. But I hope they have someone like you to remind them that even the biggest problems can be solved when brave people decide to speak up." Elena considered this with characteristic seriousness. "Daddy, if we ever meet aliens, I'm going to tell them about how one janitor changed everything by loving his daughter enough to ask for help." Richard laughed, pulling Elena close as they watched the stars wheel overhead. In the distance, the lights of Meridian Falls twinkled like earthbound constellations, each one representing families who slept more peacefully because one father had refused to accept that his daughter's pain was the price of corporate profits. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand their model of employee-centered business practices. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars that had always inspired Elena's dreams, Richard Hernandez, former night janitor, current executive, forever father, simply marveled at how far love and courage could carry a family when they refused to give up hope. Some stories end with dramatic victories or fairy tale transformations. But the best stories end with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that ordinary people, armed with extraordinary love, can change the world one family, one company, one community at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.